Imagine yourself as a high-achieving, goal-oriented student at report card time. You open your envelope and immediately start checking your marks to calculate your average. As you go through your courses, you finally reach your math section, the one you've been most worried about. As you see it, your heart drops. It's a full 15% lower than your overall average. That happens to be our exact situation when it comes to Canada's youth voter turnout rate. Of course, the issues of academic grade averages and voter turnout rates are very different. But that sense of disappointment at such a big discrepancy, that is something that affects every caring Canadian when they hear the following statistic. In the 2015 Canadian federal election, 54% of the youth electorate, 18 to 21-year-olds, voted. 54%. That's a full 14.5% lower than the overall average. This discrepancy has existed, especially around voters the age of 18, ever since they were first granted the right to vote in 1970. Upon hearing this, some might argue that we ought to strip these 18-year-olds of their right to vote, right? Wrong. The actual solution to this problem is quite the opposite. We need to be lowering the minimum voting age to 16. In the 1960s and 70s, many countries were offering their 18-year-olds the right to vote. This was a result of a global movement. The war in Vietnam had been raging for more than a decade, and many young men had lost their lives. In the United States, 18-year-olds could be conscripted to the army to fight in the war, but then couldn't vote back home. Eventually, people began realizing that these young men should have the right to vote for the people that create the policies that send them to war. Today, the movement is a little bit less about the lack of representation, although that is certainly an issue. Now, it is more about the respect of rights, the betterment of society, and the intellectual capability of the young Canadian citizen. Firstly, in any democracy, representation is critical. With climate change becoming increasingly threatening, decisions made today will significantly affect future generations. According to the United Nations, the world has less than 11 years to radically change its ways before the damage to this planet becomes irreversible. 11 years. For 16-year-olds, that means waiting 2 more years to vote on policies that will affect them more than anyone else. And with a timeline of 11 years, a 2-year wait is astronomical. In the words of the United Nations General Assembly President, quote, "Climate justice is an intergenerational justice," end quote. That not only includes 16 and 17-year-olds, but is especially applicable to them. Many of those in power today will not see the worst days of the climate crisis due to the requirement of age, tenure, and experience to be elected to office. And frankly, by that time, many of them will be too out of touch to face the consequences of their decisions. The time has come to, at the extreme least, allow more young people to have a voice in determining which of these adults makes such decisions. Allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote would force politicians to fight for the vote of a new demographic, to empathize with the concerns and listen to the voices of a new group of individuals. It would force them to be better and do more, especially with issues such as climate change. Another benefit of allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote would be an increase in voter turnout rates. Voting is a lifeline of democracy. The world's healthiest democracies, as measured by the World Democracy Index, have very high voter turnout rates. That is why governments do all that they can to raise that rate of participation. Sometimes this means advertising or promoting, providing services to those who are unable to visit voting booths by themselves, or even doling out fines to those who refuse to vote in certain countries. However, one of the best possible ways to engage more and more people and solve the dangerous issue of this low voter turnout rate would be to allow younger people to vote. According to a study conducted by the London School of Economics, a voter's first 2 election cycles are key in determining their future voting habits. It increases twofold for every subsequent election in which they vote. Starting this process at 16 is the recipe for a lifelong voter. And here is why. A few municipalities in the United States already allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in local elections. And unsurprisingly, their voter turnout rates are significantly higher than the national and state average. Tacoma Park, Maryland became the first such municipality to do so in 2013. And in their election that year, 16 and 17-year-olds turned out at the polls at a rate of a staggering 30% higher than every single other age group. And that trend continued into the next election cycles of 2015 and the one in 2017. Another example of this is in Austria, where 16 and 17-year-olds have had the right to vote in federal and municipal elections since 2007. In the 2013 Austrian national rat election, 63% of 16 and 17-year-olds voted. While this was still below the general turnout of 75%, it was hugely impressive, keeping in mind that whenever new demographics are granted the ability to vote, it takes a considerable amount of time for the voting rate gap to close. 1920 was the first year that women in the United States were granted the right to vote on a large-scale basis, and in the election that year, 36% of women voted compared to 68% of men. Of course, one cannot ignore the fact that at the time, many men did not allow their wives to vote. But it still took more than 5 decades for the gender voting rate gap to close. The fact that 16 and 17-year-olds have gotten so close in Austria in just 6 years is truly remarkable and quite telling. This phenomenon has been researched by Professor Mark Franklin of Trinity College, and he states that 18 is perhaps the categorically least opportunistic age to give an individual the right to vote. Instead, he states that 16 is a kind of sweet spot for this right. The reason for this being that typically 16-year-olds are still living at home with their parents, meaning that stuff like newspapers, news networks, and dinner table discussions about politics are far more likely to come up. Not only that, but unlike at 18, 16-year-olds are typically not in the process of moving or applying to universities or dealing with all sorts of other transition responsibilities that come with becoming a legal adult. These factors, according to Dr. Franklin, render 16 the optimal age to start voting. By increasing the chances that an individual will vote in their very first election, we would be increasing the chances that they vote in every subsequent one. Not only is it very likely that allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote, that would increase the voter turnout rate, it's also very likely that it would make us, as a society, overall, better voters. According to the Annenberg Constitution Day Civic Survey, conducted in the United States in 2018, only 1 in 3 American adults could name the 3 branches of government. Well, government structure and function are a focal point of senior high social science courses, for which students must learn about and memorize the 3 branches of government, and much, much more. If we can capitalize on high school's education of government and society and politics, policy, critical thinking, we can ensure that 16 and 17-year-old voters are more informed and better educated than adult voters. Not only that, but according to renowned psychologist Christopher Muncy, voting is a habit. Not just a habit of whether or not to vote, but actually a habit of how to vote. If for students' very first elections through schools, we can set a habit of studying and learning about their choices before coming to a decision, we can create generations of lifelong voters who will continue to study and learn about their choices before coming to a decision. Additionally, voting booths are very common either in or around high school zones. So theoretically, voting could even become a part of social science courses, once again reinforcing that ideal habit-creating path. Now, a prevalent idea that is against giving them the right to vote is the notion that they are not capable. This is a dangerous underestimation. Amongst the most typical statements are that they lack the political maturity of 18-plus-year-olds and that their brains are not fully developed. Firstly, a study conducted in the United States by Psychology Today in 2018 showed that 16 and 17-year-olds have similar, and in certain cases, greater political efficacy, knowledge, tolerance, interests, and skills than 18-year-olds. Another study, this time in Austria, conducted by Electoral Studies in 2012, showed that the process by which 16 and 17-year-olds vote is similar to that of older voters, meaning that they do cast votes in ways that enable their interests. Secondly, recent research in neuroscience suggests that there are 2 types of cognition that our brains use. According to Professor Barbara Sahakian of the University of Cambridge, these 2 different types of cognition serve very different purposes. Quote, "We use 2 forms of cognition. One kind of cognition is called cold cognition, and that's usually what we think about: attention, memory, and everyday types of things. It's really non-emotional cognition. And then there's hot cognition, which is emotional social cognition. For decisions such as voting, our brains use cold cognition." End quote. While hot cognition continues developing until the mid-20s, cold cognition is fully developed and mature by the age of, you guessed it, 16. 16 and 17-year-olds are perfectly capable, both intellectually and scientifically, of making political decisions. Now, as with similar historical voting reforms, it will take time for more and more young people to show up at the polls. We must not forget that after the suffragette movement, it took more than 5 decades for the gender voting rate gap to close. But it did. With a chance and a little bit of time, generations of more informed, caring, younger voters will come forward to get that average up, change the country, and change the world.